Undercities have captured the imaginations of fantasy fans all over the world, seemingly forever. Monsters in sewers, grand buried ancient temples under the earth, tunnels everywhere inhabited by criminals, monsters and, of course, long forgotten mole people. But how did all of this get there? Sewer systems on the scale of fantasy RPGs, with tunnels big enough for people to move in, let alone get lost in, didn't exist until the 1800s in our world, and grand cavernous spaces with the occasional underground building tend not to be great at bearing the weight of an entire new city built directly above them. So what are real undercities? How can they work? And how can we make this trope far more interesting? It is certainly true that around the world, the older a city or place is, the more layers of stuff gets piled up. A great fantasy example of this lies in the golden city of Tyr from Athos, the Dark Sun setting, which has faced destruction and environmental challenges of so many types that we can see various examples of how undercities come to be in one place. Built on swampy land, the original city was held up by stilts, leaving an underlayer when all the waters on Athos receded. Large sections of the city have been built on top of older structures. Underground rivers have created underground tunnels. Crypts and catacombs have been carved out underground, now lying forgotten. And there are even temples to old taboo gods buried in rubble under the city. Now you may be thinking that so many distinct types of subterranean space created by so many different methods seems a little unrealistic. But we do have a real-world example of exactly this. Rome. Under the Piazza Navona, right here, is an entire underground ancient stadium. Many of these buildings around rely on the ancient stadium to hold them up, and that is why this piazza is so weirdly shaped. You can even see the circle at the end where the chariots turned. This is the ancient Forum of Rome, and it's significantly lower than the rest of the city. When the civic centre moved out of this place, it was abandoned and left completely alone. The River Tiber flooded again and again, burying the place behind me in mud, silt, and eventually just ground. In fact, this was at one point pastoral grazing land. That's how buried this entire beautiful undercity was. The Gardens of Sallust, once owned by Julius Caesar, were a collection of recreational buildings in a fertile valley. In time, they were filled in with rubble, to such an extent that they needed to be excavated to this level. For all three of these structures, there are different reasons for their burial. But the fact remains that the river here in Rome helped with burying each and every one of them. Nonetheless, our undercities could certainly be improved if we remember that many of the places in them could be buried just under the street's surface, and many of these places may not have had the rubble excavated out from them quite yet. Rome has its fair share of crypts and catacombs as well. These were mostly carved out excavated chambers outside the city walls. But as the city swelled and grew, they eventually became a veritable undercity of their own, a layer deeper still, as they were carved into the earth, than the buried temples and buildings that we discussed earlier. But let's talk about burying buildings, rubble and silt. Most of archaeology is not just popping open a random basement and finding a bunch of fully intact ancient buildings under the earth. As we saw with Rome's Forum, many of the structures didn't survive the ravages of time intact under the earth, and many more required targeted, difficult, and concentrated excavation in order to get down to them. In almost every fantasy property I can recall, any undercity that exists comes pre-excavated, cleared of rubble, soil and silt, and functioning more like a city, but with more criminals and less light. And that's a real shame. There are so many stories to be told in the excavation and clearance of old rubble-filled ruins, from miners and demolitions experts stumbling across ancient magics to stability risks on the streets above, like sinkholes. Perhaps a team animates a catacomb's dead to do all the excavation for them, or perhaps a city secretly excavates thousand-year-old crypts to use to house a secret immigrant class, an underclass, or an academy for a kind of dark kind of magic. Especially in D&D, we all love getting creative with an Undercity dungeon. But there's no way that a party is the first to explore an ancient, forgotten tomb if all the built-up dirt and rubble that originally buried it under the ground has been miraculously cleared right up until the point where you can see the ominous door with skulls on it. Perhaps in a similar way as we run explorations across unknown lands, we can develop explorations and excavations of the crawl spaces left behind after things are filled in, perhaps following an ancient wall as you carve through the earth to find, for the first time, a place only mentioned in thousand-year-old histories and legends. It's also worth noting that things get buried for a reason. Conscious choices are made to allow things to become ruins or become the cellars of new buildings. Oftentimes it's simple safety concerns or aesthetic. This place is 500 years old, I'd rather take the good stones from it and use them as foundations for something new. But it can be that things are deliberately built over or intentionally abandoned. Rome's Forum was buried simply because the city's commercial centre moved and nobody bothered to maintain the old Forum's drainage system. So it flooded over and over again and got buried. The Church of San Clemente in Rome is an example of both of these things, intentionally abandoned and deliberately built over. The 12th century basilica sits atop a 4th century church, which is ruined now. It was likely built to replace the 4th century church. But this 4th century church has underneath it a different shrine, a shrine to the religious movement of Mithraism, a rival to Christianity which didn't make it into the modern era. This ancient shrine was likely buried with significant intent when the Christian church was constructed for the first time in the 4th century. Buildings dedicated to faiths or practices that might now be considered unsavory are the greatest candidates for buildings that are covered over and built over in rubble, like the Temple of Baal in Baldur's Gate. Although that being situated within a great cavernous mess of tunnels is pushing it, I would say, in terms of strict realism at least. But Rome is a massive, vastly storied city, the sort of place you'd expect an underground temple or two. So how can we do Undercities in places on a slightly less grand scale? Tunnels. Tunnels are one of the more common things to find in old cities, not just for sewage, but for a number of reasons. To discuss this further, I'm heading off again to some other cities in Europe. The streets and buildings of Palermo may hide the fact that under the entire city there is a vast network of Arabic tunnels called qanats, responsible for sending water to the various fountains, gardens and plants that needed to be fed during their occupation of the island of Sicily. They still exist today under the city streets, half filled with water and completely accessible if you know where to go. You might think these are regular, beautiful Maltese gardens, and you'd be right, but underneath our very feet is a collection of tunnels used in the Second World War. In fact, under most of Valletta, the main capital city of Malta, there are these tunnels which stretch out that were used for strategy, defense, and fortification that defended this very island during the Second World War. In cities which are occupied, you can find resistance tunnels under the grounds quite often, forming an undercity of their own. And that's why in so many historic and fractious places, you will find underneath the cities a series of tunnels used by all sorts of people for all sorts of things. In this case, war. As well as catacombs, tunnels are an incredibly versatile tool for a city's citizens, from personal use to smuggling, from acting as bolt holes or travel paths for oppressed groups, to a secret base during war or during an external oppression. The humble underground tunnel is the ideal place to act outside the public eye. If there are enough individuals with motivation and means to hide something, it is very likely that eventually some of these tunnels will begin to connect. Less of a traditional undercity and more of a warren. Especially in cities with softer ground, this is certainly feasible. And if sewers really do need to be involved, at least those huge 19th century storm drain styled sewers, then yes, civil infrastructure can readily intersect with private infrastructure in major ways, as well as with potentially criminal or resistance infrastructure as well. Many fantasy properties do this already, linking various different ages of tunnels together in this vast, complicated maze of underground stuff. But frankly, I think it's more realistic and indeed interesting to develop man-sized tunnels for man-sized operations. In essence, skip the sewers. They, for most of history, have never needed to fit a person down them, and use structures specifically built to be walked or moved around in, especially in D&D styled fantasy, where there's less need for mass sewage disposal than normal, considering free cleaning magic exists. But we can make interesting things out of undercities created by mass civil infrastructure, as long as we're willing to age up our fantasy settings a little bit towards more modern sensibilities. When I was discussing Dark Sun's exemplar city of Tyr, I mentioned that the ancient city was raised above a swamp on stilts. This happens to real cities too, but more often than not, it's noticed a little too late after the buildings are built that the entire city is sinking, and a huge civil project is undertaken to fix it. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Chicago. I guess we didn't have the budget. Chicago has a long and complex history, but a large part of that is a continuous attempt to rescue its buildings from the swamp. Much of the city has been raised by at least 6 feet, meaning that huge swaths of the city's infrastructure has an underground complex of support structures and spaces inaccessible to most regular people directly underneath it. This has resulted in a few things: spaces inhabited mostly by people forgotten in the system, massive underground civil maintenance work, and some fascinating architecture, best seen in The Loop, made famous in Nolan's Batman Begins. But huge civil projects can generate possibly the most undercity-like undercities conceivable. Civil projects like this are definitely not impossible in fantasy worlds, especially high fantasy, and especially if we're willing to accept some more modern sensibilities like I mentioned earlier. We've got magic, and probably magically tunneling creatures and beasts. Who's to say you can't establish an underground system like London with just a few skilled mages and a few years' work? Interconnected underground tunnels for transportation of people or goods, even through river settings, could be massively fascinating to explore as a holistic or hodgepodge undercity. So there we have it, undercities without the need to make it just a big old sewer again. I hope you've learned something and enjoyed this little look at what we can do with our underground spaces when we stick to slightly more grounded history. Let me know what tropes and topics in fantasy I should be trying to cover next. But with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.